Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Unofficial Game Pass podcast. I am your host, Odrin Johnson, and today I'm joined by Connor.
Hello.
And so, pretty much what this podcast is, it's pretty much just hopefully us going through as many of the games as possible that are available to you through Game Pass and kind of giving you our thoughts on whether they're worth downloading, whether they're worth skipping or passing if you want to kind of go down that route, or if you could kind of, give it a shot and then maybe uninstall it later. So I suppose without further ado, the game we're going to be looking at this week is The Medium, which is a psychological third-person horror title developed by the Polish developers Bloober Team. It's been in the works for a while, actually. I was, interesting enough, Connor, I was looking up before we started recording. This game was announced all the way back in 2012, which seems bizarre to me that it's only coming out now. And especially as well as an Xbox exclusive, because at the time it was initially meant to release on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and the Wii U of all consoles, which to anyone who remembers the Wii U is, going back a long time now. But they held off the game because they wanted to, wait for better technology, at least to the best of my knowledge. And I think, it came out this year, was set to release in December, but because of COVID, it got delayed a little bit. I suppose we'll jump into it straight away. And for those listening, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. We're not going to talk about any of the real in-depth parts of the game just yet. But if you're like us and you've already played the game and you want to hear sort of an unfiltered review of the game and what our actual thoughts are on it fully, we will be doing another episode after this, which will be released on Monday or Tuesday, depending on how this all goes. And you can listen to our opinions on it there. So I suppose I'll shut up for a second. Connor, what did you think of The Medium?
I loved The Medium. Straight in, I'd been watching this game for a while. I thought it was going to be my sort of thing, and I was very pleasantly surprised in the end. Actually, as you were talking about the initial reveal, did you look up any of the original trailers?
I actually see that's something, and I'll go into a little bit on this later, but I haven't looked at any of the original trailers. But I didn't even see any of the trailers for the ones coming out. I went to this game completely blind. But yeah, go on. What were you going to mention about the trailers?
See, I vaguely sort of remember a trailer. It was sort of outside like a large chapel. And when I initially heard about this game, my vision in my head for it was completely different. And obviously now we have the game, I suppose that shows just years in development how a game can change. But yeah, this game, I'll ask your opinion on it first before we get into the real nitty gritty. How did you find it?
I suppose I'll touch on one point you mentioned first about how the game's kind of developed, because initially this game was set to release as a first-person title, and obviously it's changed quite drastically in that sense. And my thoughts on the game, I think The Medium caters to a certain audience with regards to gameplay. I'm a big fan of story-driven titles and games. That's obviously I'm a huge fan of games like let me think, for example, like Halo, The Last of Us, things like that. I like gameplay-driven stuff, i.e. Mass Effect and whatnot. So when I was going into this, I was, optimistic, to say the least. I was kind of looking forward to seeing what this game had to offer, despite not knowing very much about it. And what is my thought on it? I think it's good, and I do enjoy it. I'm a big fan of, first of all, the story. I think that's its strongest point, along with, say, the music and the art direction. I think those are the best parts of it. I feel like, as a game, though, gameplay seems to be a secondary aspect, and that's perfectly fine. I think a lot of people have likened it to sort of like a walking simulator, which is, I think, an apt title for it. The puzzles in the game aren't overly complex, and if they are, I think that's more of a sort of a problem of the game's part, which I'll get onto a bit later. But I'm not going to try and dunk on the game too hard. I think it's very much probably not my cup of tea in the long term. I certainly enjoy the story, but I feel like when we talk about stories in media, I feel like The Medium would have been better suited to something like a TV show, or probably just a TV show. I wouldn't imagine it being a movie style thing. But no, yeah, sorry. What are you thinking of it?
Well, I'm really glad you have that opinion, actually, because I think that's a really true, insightful, and balanced opinion. I recognize that my own opinion is very generous of The Medium. I'm almost, I'm hungry for more. I think it's left me in a state where I want to see this character return. I want another game. I want DLC. So I'm glad that you have that view, because I do recognize it has flaws, and we'll get into those very soon. But I suppose we should outline what the game is actually about. Now, obviously, you play as a medium who can manifest in the real world, the material world, and the spirit world. And in the gameplay, they have this really interesting split screen feature where, for certain sections of the game, you see both the material world and the spirit world running in two engines at the same time. Now, I suppose that there's some conversation to be had there whether they do that interestingly enough or whether it's just a gimmick. But that makes the essential USP of this game. It's its unique feature. So I suppose I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that feature and whether that is enough, because the whole game is basically built around this mechanic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think from obviously playing the game, I think the feature of having the split screen sort of dual universe, dual interactivity is a really interesting concept and topic. However, it kind of, in my head, it goes back to sort of, what I really like about the game, which is its visuals. I'll get onto visuals, and there's a couple of problems I have with it later, but with regards to the actual art direction and the way the game is portrayed, I feel like on the surface, this isn't in a negative context I'm using the word, but the gimmick of the game, so forth, in, using that split screen element is more of, in my eyes, sort of what is it? Kind of more of a visual, like, what's the word I'm looking for here? It comes off much more as, sort of something that's there to look appealing to the player. But like, I feel like it's very underutilized. Like, and this kind of comes back to my thoughts on, the puzzles within the game. Like, there's nothing too complex about the puzzles within it. And there's a lot more they could have done with the sort of having to micromanage two settings at the same time, and I feel like they pulled a few punches when they could have put more stuff in. Like there's very little times where you'll have to be focusing on two screens at the one time. Like, it's very much, you're either looking at the the material world, or you're looking at the spirit world. You're never really paying attention to, or at least trying to pay attention to, both at the same time. And I feel like that's, so if they had incorporated that, especially in a horror game, having to sort of micromanage two things at the same time would put a lot of pressure on the player, and thus, sort of reinforce the sort of thing they were going for. I hope what I'm saying kind of makes sense. I don't know.
It absolutely makes sense. I think that there are times when, because I've just come off of playing LA Noire, which is a game where you spend walking around, picking up objects and looking at them and finding clues. And basically, I spent, the core gameplay is you do look around, you pick up various collectibles, which are all worth picking up, by the way. I massively enjoyed piecing together the story through everything, from the notes and the postcards, all the collectibles you pick up. And so there are times when you're looking in the material world and you're missing something in the spirit world. So, there are times when you need to look in both. But it could have been utilized so much better, I feel, if they had implemented combat in this game, because there are sections where you're seeking out objects, there are stealth sections, but there's really no time where you're fighting anything. And I have to admit, if this game were to get a sequel, I would love to just see this game return with combat, better controls, and kind of different gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that what we have here isn't good. It's just it is the beginning of a concept, I feel, and it's a AA project. This is a small team, Bloober Team, and but because it looks so polished visually and with the audio, I think we're expecting something really quite more polished than what it is. That there are niggles here and there, but I think what they do have is really good to build off of now.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add on to that as well. Like, obviously, I mentioned at the beginning that they initially were planning to try and release it around 2012, but they held off for more technology. So I don't think they've intentionally kind of, cut corners to make gameplay, a little less engaging just for the sake of getting it out. I think they genuinely really wanted the game to be like something that someone could sit down and thoroughly enjoy. And for the budget and the studio that they are, they've pretty like you could pass this off as a AAA game to someone if they didn't know any better. And I think that's a really big accomplishment in my eyes for them, especially. And it'll only do more to sort of propel them forward in the future. Um, Saying that though, like you touched on, the game looks extremely polished. I have to say, when I was playing, there was certain times where, and I don't know if this is a problem more so with the engine they were using or if it's a problem with the console, because I'm not too in depth on all this, but I had a constant recurring issue where textures and graphics were, taking a long time to load in. I don't know if you came across anything like that, did you?
Yeah, so in certain cinematics and walking around, there were for me sort of visual flickers or perhaps little glitches which shouldn't have been there, like flashes of color which weren't there,
Hmm.
or shouldn't have been there. I get what you mean with the textures taking a bit long. I know Digital Foundry did a video on this where you're looking through the inventory, you go onto an item and it takes a little while for it to become clear.
Hmm.
Didn't really have a problem with that until I got to a certain object. For me, it was a dollhouse in the game,
Hmm.
and I clicked on the dollhouse, and it took a long time for the textures to load in.
Yeah.
I was thinking, oh, I can't actually look at what I'm doing with this doll's house because it's blurry.
Hmm. But again, I think again it comes back to the thing that like at least in my eyes, like when I assume when this team was approaching the game, first and foremost in their mind was again story, art direction, and music. And I think they've aced all of those bits. It's just the extra bits that goes on to make it a game. Like I know this kind of sounds stupid, but the gameplay, and extra bits like visual graphics and all that. And graphics aren't important to make a game good. Some of my favorite games, and I'm sure some of your favorite games, like if you look at Halo Combat Evolved, like very much a very gameplay driven game. Graphics aren't the best on it, but it holds up today because of it has these good systems. And I think games with good stories can hold up even without good gameplay or good graphics. Mass Effect is a perfect example of that. And I think the medium, in a sense, is very much it does what it aims to do really really well. It's just I'm kind of expecting more out of it, and I don't know if that's a bit naive of me.
No, I mean that's a fair assumption because we have big expectations of games. I feel like we can't really get into the nitty gritty of where this game falls down without first talking a little bit more about the story and the premise.
Hmm.
Would you be happy to talk about that without spoilers?
Oh yeah, go for it.
So you play as Marianne, who obviously, as we said, is a medium, and you start off in. I'm not going to reveal too much, but you start off working in a funeral parlor, I believe,
Hmm.
which leads to a really good introductory scene. Really interesting scene there, and eventually you end up getting a call and going to investigate this basically derelict building, which is a Neva resort. And you go in and you find out, well, things aren't right because the building is very creepy to start off with, but you see
Yeah.
in the spirit world there's almost sort of this energy hub of bad energy.
Hmm.
So something, there's almost been like a tear in reality or something bad has happened here. And so this is the premise of the game, that you're a medium, you're investigating what has happened in this place to uh, bring about this unnatural rift. Now, going back to my first experience of the game, I boot up the game and I see, okay, I'm walking around, I'm picking up objects. I'm used to this gameplay. I can feed the cat, brilliant. Uh, and then I spend about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes stuck in the beginning area, and I don't know where to look to find the object that I need. I don't know. I don't know what your experience was.
I would, in fairness, I feel like I need a bit more detail on it, but I don't think I got particularly too stuck at the beginning.
Okay, I don't think this is going to ruin much. The tie clip, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
I was thinking, okay, I need to find the tie clip, so I know where I'm looking. And so there's a kitchen, there's 2 rooms, there's a bathroom, and I'm looking at all these areas. I've touched everything. I've touched everything. Where is this tie clip? I'm going to like the places where I think it must be. I keep returning to this room. I think it must be in this room. And anyway, it turns out that when you look at something, you can look around the area that you've looked in, and you also have something called insight, where you can look, and with your medium intuition, you can find objects hidden behind obstacles or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think most of the puzzles in this game where I got stumped is I simply forgot which abilities were at my disposal.
Yeah.
There are multiple times where I forgot I could go out of my body, and which had me walking around rooms or areas thinking, where am I supposed to go? And it was literally because a way was open to one of me, probably in the spirit world, that wasn't open to me in the material world. And maybe that's down to me not looking in both areas. But I simply forgot I had that ability. So that was my first frustration with this game.
No, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, but I was just going to jump in there because I definitely agree with you on that point, and it was something I was going to raise as well. Like, and it kind of goes back again to sort of an underutilization of the game's mechanics, because it introduces these sort of core aspects of gameplay that in many other games you'd be using constantly throughout. But like, there's times in the game where you use insight, as you say, near the beginning, and then you don't use it for like another hour or hour and a half within game time, and by that time, you know, in the player's mind, you know, you've kind of forgotten that ability exists, because the game is throwing so much at you, like, you know, with regards to story, and you're trying to absorb all that, and, you know, it's not reinforced enough to the player that this is an ability at your disposal.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you're a game developer, you have to cement those controls in the player's mind, and so that I know Super Meat Boy did this really well back in the day, where it had a huge gap and you had to sprint to get across it, or it had a wall with no wall on the other side, so you could learn that you can jump up a single wall by jumping off the same wall. And you know, those abilities need to be cemented to the player, and I feel like they weren't in my head as solutions that I could use. And you know, it's not nice, because that makes me feel like an idiot as a player. Now, an idiot I may be, but I don't revel in that feeling.
No, and like I don't think you'd be on your own. I think anyone who's played the game, you know, maybe if you did it in one sitting, because that's something I want to touch on. This game is very short, with regards to, you know, actual gameplay. But if you did it in, like, say, 1 or 2 sittings, you may, you know, remember the stuff off the top of your head. But like, at least like for me, like, I did it in about 3 sittings, and I was still, you know, forgetting late game that I had certain abilities, because they hadn't been used in so long, and there was very little need for them. And I think that's not a fault of the game, but almost a sort of a, what is the word I'm looking for? Almost a, you know, a result of the game, you know, because as I mentioned, the puzzles in the game are quite simplistic in nature, because obviously it focuses more on story, art, music, as I mentioned before. So when you get to a puzzle that, you know, requires at least a bit more thought, not a lot now, but a bit more, where you have to use your abilities and whatnot, it stumps you almost, because you're just so used to this sort of general continuation of easy puzzles as you go through and just experience the story. So I feel like this game doesn't know really what it wants to be. On one hand, it wants to, you know, engage in a compelling story, and, you know, kind of have gameplay as almost a second-hand feature that you experience the story through. And then in other elements, it tries to, you know, be really gameplay focused and really puzzle focused, but it either ends up falling flat, or it's just kind of out of place.
Yeah, I've heard other people describe that throughout the game, or especially in the first 2 hours, say it tries to do a lot of different things and it introduces a lot of different gameplay elements, and it's not really sure which one it wants to be.
Hmm.
I think that's fair. There are certain things in the game where you do something and it may only last for one section of the game, and you never use that power again. For instance, there was a power that you used halfway through the game. I don't know if you'll know what I'm talking about, but you use the X button to do it,
Yeah.
and it's sort of a telekinesis in the spirit world, and you only use it there. And I was expecting that to come back, and it wasn't. So there are lots of things where I feel in a longer game where they know what gameplay they want to go for, where they've refined the controls, this could be a really great game. But at the moment, what we've got is a fantastic story.
Hmm.
Now, I suppose I'll call myself a writer because I'm studying literature and creative writing at university.
Yeah.
So what I appreciate in my games are really good stories. We both love Halo. I've always been in Halo for the story, the atmosphere, the music, and this game really delivers on those three. It really, really impressed me. And that's from the main character and her delivery. I found her really charming. So a lot of people have said that she talks too much, or she over explains things that she's doing that are obvious. There's a point where she has these bolt cutters, and she keeps making a recurring joke about the bolt cutters. Now I found that more charming than I did silly. Although it's hard to get realism right, but I liked it. I liked her delivery. I got on well with the character.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a brilliant voice actress. In fairness, Kelly Burke is the name of her, and the only other title I've kind of encountered her voice work in was Terminator Resistance. Granted, I don't know if she has a load of other sort of roles within the gaming genre. But kind of speaking on voice actors, funny enough, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but the voice of, and this is no spoiler because it's shown in the trailers and it was in the promo, the Maw, who you'll come to see within the game, is voiced by none other than Troy Baker, who everyone will know as the man who's in pretty much every single video game known to man.
Yes, also Joel in The Last of Us, I believe.
Yes, yeah.
I was extremely impressed with the Maw, which in the game is an entity. It's the main sort of monster that you're facing. And while this game, I wouldn't say this is a particularly scary game. The aesthetic of horror is there, and it's a really rich aesthetic because the spirit world is inspired by an actual painter. It might be a Polish painter they decided to be influenced by, and in the first 2 hours there are jump scares which I think, oh, these are great. If these continue throughout the game, I'm going to love them. But I think as the game goes on, it becomes more and more invested in its story.
Yeah.
But the voice acting of the Maw and what Troy Baker does for this role is astounding. I mean, you can tell he's enjoying this role because it is very different for him. And I've heard, I know Greg Miller on the Kind of Funny podcast said, why would you hire Troy Baker to modulate his voice like that? That's not Troy Baker modulating his voice. That is
genuinely him, yeah.
Contorting his voice, and you can look it up in the behind the scenes on the Bloober Team YouTube, and it is fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the one thing that makes a brilliant voice actor, especially in the gaming medium, is if they can portray a character and you can't link them to any of their other previous characters. And that's what Troy Baker does so well in this game. Like, I was genuinely shocked when I was looking up and thinking, Troy Baker's in this game. Who does Troy Baker game? And my first instinct was, oh, he probably plays Thomas. But no, he doesn't. He plays the main villain in the game, or, the main creature. I wouldn't even, I would go so far as to not even label it as a villain. I think there's different ways of labeling what the Maw actually is in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I said monster. I was refraining from using monster creature, but Bloober Team themselves used the words monster, so I don't feel too bad about using that word.
Hmm.
But again, props to them. Really interesting character in itself that you can't quite define it so easily because it does have its own. It doesn't have a huge expanded background, but it does have its reasons, which is what you want in a video game monster. You don't just want this faceless, nameless entity that's it just wants to kill you.
Hmm. No, yeah, for sure, because there's as players will come to realize when they go through the game, like the inner complexities of like what the Maw actually represents and the story, and the role he plays within the story is it just grows and grows as because when I first initially saw the Maw, I was like, oh, here it is, the big bad villain of the game, like, but no, it's a lot more than that, and it's a much more complex narrative that the Maw kind of adds on to, which we'll talk a bit more in the sort of unfiltered discussion of this. But I do want to go back to one point you mentioned about the art style and the art, and particularly the art style of the Maw. The painter they referenced, and please forgive me because I've listened to about 5 videos trying to pronounce this guy's name and I still have no idea how to do it, but I'm going to give it my best shot. It's Zdzislaw Beksiński, I think is how you say it, and pretty much he's most known for sort of old age Baroque Gothic paintings, and there's definitely, like, if you look at any of the pieces that he's done, you can see the medium in them and you can see what they've been inspired by. So I'm happy to see that, like, there's this, like, it says a lot more about, like, it's particularly about the medium of games when they're drawing direct inspiration from other levels of art and other levels of media, and are able to incorporate it into a completely different setting and still retain sort of the garishness and the sort of the horror elements that those paintings represented. So I think from a standpoint, it does that fantastically within this game.
Yeah, definitely. I thought while you were talking there, you said earlier that the medium might do better as a film or a TV series. And I was thinking, how many horror films or horror series do you see which actually pull off a story which I would say it's a fantastic experience, and just I think it vocalizes the argument for video games as art. I think it would completely ruin this if it was a horror film or a horror series for me. I think the way you experience it and how creatively this was done, I really love this, and I think that when you release a horror show, there's certain things that you're doing to please a certain audience. I think they've crafted something really unique here.
Because I think, especially this game, it very much gives off that sort of how do you describe it? Almost X-Files kind of feel to it. Not in the sense that it's like very much like aliens and stuff like that and everything, but it gives off the sort of, or as I could imagine the medium being adapted into a show that would follow the life of Marianne, whether it's before the game or even kind of a different alternative to the game of her, because we see this at the beginning, and this isn't really a spoiler. One of the main things of being a medium is guiding spirits into the afterlife, and I think that would be a really interesting premise for a short or a show if they did something like that, because that's a really good idea of sort of like asking the questions about the boundary of where do people go after death, and it's asking big questions, this game, and that's again, as you said, cementing it in as a legitimate form of art. And I think that's what, as much as, say, I don't enjoy the gameplay of these games, I think they're as important to the gaming medium as any sort of shooter game that kind of comes about. They are important in their own element, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can definitely see the sort of the influences from other video games, and that that's going back to the original Silent Hills and Resident Evils, where you have fixed camera angles in horror games, and you have the inventory, and I enjoyed those parts of this game, the kind of throwback. And I know that fixed camera angles is always a problem in video games, because you're always thinking, oh, why are you showing me this from here? But it was sort of nice as a nostalgic throwback at the very least. So I enjoyed that. Did you encounter particular problems with the camera?
I think the only real considerable problems that came up reoccurring wise was, say if your camera angle changes while you're walking and it doesn't properly register what direction you're moving in. So you could be pointing in the direction of where the new camera angle is going, but you're still walking a completely different direction. So that took a little bit of getting used to. There were a couple of sort of like, I suppose I'm going to use it as vague as possible, pursuit scenes within the game that were very difficult to manage when it came to, you know, changing camera angles. But no, it's few and far between, and you know, I definitely enjoyed the sort of callback to the, like, I have down in my notes here, the like sort of Resident Evil vibe that those camera angles sort of gave off. So I did enjoy that element of it, and I think it was probably the best way they could have, you know, incorporated that into this game.
Yeah, I was going to mention the pursuit scenes because, you know, throughout this game I do feel I had some cheap deaths, let's say. And I think in one of the early pursuit scenes, I actually had to turn up my brightness. I don't know if you found that the default brightness was too dark, but I ended up turning it up probably 75% of the way because I think, oh, I can't see anything. And in the pursuit scene, I think I literally, every time in the first pursuit scene, let's say, every time I should have turned the corner, if you don't turn that corner, you get stuck and you die. And I think I did that probably in 3 goes, and every time you had to turn the corner, I died because I literally couldn't see where I should be turning. And you know, that could have been me not having the brightness up, but I felt, you know, this feels a pretty cheap death, because to get stuck and not be able to do anything about it and therefore die. Not happy about that. I'm all for, if you get yourself in a sticky situation, you should be able to work yourself out of it with the gameplay.
Yeah, and the brightness is an interesting thing that you touch on, because when I was setting it up at the beginning, you know, the sample image it gives you for the brightness, I actually turned it down a little bit because I thought, oh, this will make it a bit more, you know, give it a bit more ambience, like it'll be sort of a bit more horror invested. But then when you go into the game, like there was one section where it's like, I'm going down some stairs and it just looks like I'm walking on a black screen. So I like put it to the, you know, the default one, and it was fine then. But as you say, like there's moments where that's not even enough. Like, and I persevered through it because I didn't want to, like, there's a thing, I'm not a big fan of like turning the brightness up so much that, you know, darkness is just kind of like a figment of your imagination at that stage. But like there's certain times where you just have to do it just to get through something, to slog through it. And I think that's a detriment to the gameplay, and it does, like, and it rips you out of sort of the immersion that the game is trying to go for.
Yeah, that sample image for the brightness is completely different. Now that I've heard you say that, I'm happy to say that is completely different to what you experience in the gameplay. So I'm happy you've said that.
Yeah.
But you know, I've heard people sort of reference Alan Wake or Control when playing this game, and I think that, you know, for you know, you mentioned X-Files. I think when you play this game, there is an element of the supernatural existing alongside the real, and certain bureaus or organizations dealing with those instances. You know, there's a good atmosphere, there's a good genre that they're playing into that can easily lead into a different game.
I think, yeah, going off that sort of Control Alan Wake sort of comparison that people are bringing up, I think I can definitely see where that's coming from, though, because the music especially, I think, very much gives off Control elements, that like bits that I, you know, the sort of heavy sort of synth that you kind of hear in regards to, say, in certain pursuit scenes, there's that heavy drone that keeps going up. It was the piece of music I used for the promo for the actual podcast. Like there's elements of like I really love the music in this game. I think it's fantastic, and the way it, you know, incorporates you know, sort of this ambience. Like there's no one track that you're like, oh, this is the heavy track now, this is like, you know, the final effort of or the finish the fight of the medium. It's very much all sort of like one continuous like hour to 3 hours sort of music that incorporates and changes as the game goes on, and it works very well. But it does give off that very sort of Remedy inspired vibe, I would go with. But yeah, no, yeah, I can definitely see where that's coming from, and you know, the games like that incorporate supernatural elements, I think, will always sort of be compared to other games that do similar. So yeah.
And are you aware of what they did with the composers?
I amn't now, no.
So they had one composer compose all the music for the Material World, which is the composer that I think has worked on the previous Bloober Team games, so Layers of Fear, Blair Witch. And you had Akira Yamaoka, who worked on the Silent Hill games, do the Spirit World.
Yeah.
And they closely collaborated together to have cohesion between them, but have like a separate sound. And when you're walking around, the kind of ambience, there's an eerie silence. The way they use silence is amazing, and I think the soundtrack itself, if I've been listening to it, and it is one of those soundtracks that you can just listen to. There's a lot of good stuff on there. I love the More track. I think it beautifully, kind of creepily sets up that tension for when you come across the More. I think that there's even a track that, I don't know, later in the game you can play a radio, and there's a track where Troy Baker features singing on it. There's a lot of good gems on that soundtrack, and I'm very pleased with it.
Yeah, because music within games now, especially soundtracks and whatnot, you're very unlikely to find a bad soundtrack within a game. It's sort of like the separation between soundtracks now in games seems to be, is something good or is something great? And I think this soundtrack is great. It fits the setting perfectly. It incorporates elements of gameplay. What little gameplay I think there is, but it incorporates and changes to deal with certain scenarios and everything. That's really the one thing that game music should be doing. And it's not good enough anymore really to just kind of make a decent soundtrack. And what you told me there about them having two different composers for two different worlds shows that there's a level of complexity into the way that they're again approaching the music, story, visual aspects of the game, like that many games would kind of overlook. And I think it's really important that those aspects are promoted more within the gaming medium. But that's a really interesting fact. I didn't know that, so that was interesting.
Yeah, I've been diving. You can watch all the Bloober Team behind the scenes and stuff on their YouTube channel. Had a really deep dive, and I've been watching this game for a long time, and it didn't let me down. Although I was expecting it in December, but it obviously needed that time for polish, and I expect that they will be polishing it more. I hope, because not everything is perfect yet, but I think that what was I going to say? Help me out, Aldrin.
Were you going to say again how amazing the game is and how much you really enjoyed it?
You know what? It sucks to be so generous towards this game, because I have bought Observer System Redux, which is the remake of their Cyberpunk game that they made. I don't know if you're very aware of Bloober Team, but I hadn't played any game previously. I think this is the wonder of Game Pass. They can release a game on Game Pass, and all their previous titles can, their Blair Witch can be downloaded on Game Pass, and if people enjoy that as well, they can buy Observer, and it really gives them more exposure, and they've already made their production costs back, so just shows how successful Game Pass is for these developers.
Yeah, because I genuinely don't think you'd get the odd people who'd be mentioning the game were it to come off as a single title, but I think Game Pass has almost elevated its presence, because a lot of the time, especially when it comes to a title coming exclusively to Xbox first of all, and then going to Game Pass on day one, Xbox are going to really push a lot of budget and advertisement behind that, and that is definitely, I think it's kind of shot the argument in the foot that developers lose money if they put a game on Game Pass, and it's not a sustainable feature, because like as you mentioned, they've already made back their development costs. They're going to continue to make money on this game. As you said, like if they expand on it and do maybe more DLC, like that's going to be extra revenue that's coming into them. So like it's shown that with the right attitude and with the right backing, especially from Xbox, a game can make back its money whilst also making it extremely affordable for the consumer, which is a win-win at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think now I was just thinking about how I experienced this game, and I wanted to ask you, because as you go along this game, certain details of the plot are kept hidden, and how I played it I was picking up every collectible, and I know that I've told you I got every achievement apart from one where I must have missed one postcard or something, which is infuriating. But we'll skip that. But I was piecing this story together in my head. You get different writings, you're not sure who the authors are, and you're trying to put the names to these different voices that you pick up from different notes, different accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pretty certain of certain plot points before they were actually revealed, and I was just wondering what your experience of it was.
I think, first of all, I want to touch on the fact that, having these sort of like side story bits and extra bits that add to the story kind of hidden in the form of, say, like the postcards, as we mentioned, is a really good way of engaging a player to go back and play the game again, especially for a game that's not very gameplay driven and is more sort of story driven, like the Medium. With regards to, kind of getting an idea of what was going on, I don't think it was particularly revealed to me. I think elements like when you're, let me think, for example, like the insight feature when you're, looking back on memories and whatnot, and then it'll kind of click in your head. It's like, oh, this is what this letter meant, or what this postcard meant. So it's always kind of, it gets your brain rattling as to what might be happening next, and I think that's a really brilliant way in which it's functioned. But I can't say for certain that there was any sort of bits where I was like, oh, I know what's going to happen before it actually happens.
Right, and there is a certain part of the game now. People have said that it wasn't my experience. I mean, I was absolutely infatuated with the game from the time it booted up. Well, from the time I actually found the tie clip and I got out the first room, let's say, I was absolutely in. But some people have said that there is a moment about 2 hours into the game, they call it the wheelchair moment, where you have to get up to the wheelchair to suddenly kind of get in. That's your entry point to, oh, this is what the story is about, and it actually captures you. Were you feeling like you weren't really into it until that point, or what did that point do for you?
Yeah, no, definitely. I would agree with that statement a lot. Like, I think it hooks you kind of at the beginning. And I think the one thing we kind of didn't really touch on now, but I think we'll touch on a bit more in the Unfiltered episode, is like, the beginning of the game is very different to, say, the mid of the game or the end of the game. And it almost like feels to me whenever I go back and I watch the sort of the opening scenes again, it seems like it's in a completely different game. Like there's elements that are just kind of introduced, or characters that are introduced and then just never really mentioned again, bar maybe one appearance. And you might know who I'm talking about. But like, it's just, yeah, no, definitely when you get to the wheelchair is when the stuff starts getting, you're kind of piecing together what's kind of going on. And also at that stage as well, like the story gets very dark, and there's a lot of really dark elements into it as well. Like not so much on the horror side, but more on sort of the, just from a real world sort of perspective on it, like really kind of messed up stuff is kind of happening in it. So you kind of get more invested in that. You kind of want to know what happens. But yeah, no, definitely from that point on, sort of, I think that's around mid to sort of just past mid game, is when the story really starts to grip people. Everything before that, though, saying that, story-wise is still very good. And I think in a sense, if you were to take story progression, your most intriguing part should probably be the mid to the end. So maybe that was intentional on their part. But yeah, I do agree with what you were saying.
Yeah, I think this is an uncomfortable story. On my part, I feel it's sensitively done. I feel it doesn't dwell in the darkness of its narrative. I feel it pulls it off well. I do feel that, as you say, the beginning of the story, you might feel that it's setting up to be a proper horror game where there are scares and it is creepy and it sets up that vibe. Now, I think the story they want to tell is actually quite a sincere, quite a personal story.
Mm-hmm.
And as you get into that story, there's no way of sustaining that horror, because ultimately the story does not match that vibe.
Yeah,
I feel this is what it becomes is actually something, you start off with this kind of spiky surface of a game, and actually it's got this really soft core.
Mm-hmm. Even on top of that, like I would, if you were to compare it to something in a different medium, so say like I would almost compare it to the likes of say Black Mirror. So like like something on the surface that looks sort of, you know, very much cliched, run of the mill, but then almost has like per episode, or in this case the game, has a deeper story to tell and more questions about sort of existentialism and a bit about, you know, life after death and everything, and more topics that are discussed throughout the game. So it presents itself as, you know, almost a run of the mill horror game, especially from the trailers as well. Like you don't get this sense of like divine complexity or different questions that the game's trying to ask. It very much kind of presents itself as this sort of horror game and the monsters after you. But the game itself, as you said, has a very soft core, and it, you know, explores varying different themes. And I think, you know, in the way it does it, I think it's fantastically well executed. I just think that at certain points, like there's almost, as I mentioned earlier, you know, elements introduced or characters introduced that, you know, are purely there to sort of service that cliched outlook before then getting into the real proper story.
Yes, I wonder if it's a problem, because I've heard people say that there's this kind of Steam refund system where you can only refund a game after a certain amount of hours played.
I think it's 4 hours, yeah.
Right, so some games in their first 4 hours are selling you something really, really good, and then after those 4 hours, it's a completely different game. You know, a comparison I could make is, you know, say the opening to Cyberpunk leaves you really in anticipation for what the game's going to be. After that, it might not be so polished. You know, maybe that's a bad comparison, but in this game, you know, to sell the game, they are setting it up for what is very much a horror game. What you end up with is more of a detective mystery story driven game. And I don't know if that's a problem with the industry. I don't know if that's a problem with how we as consumers go so much off the marketing and off the images that are sold to us. But I don't feel it's a particular problem in this game, because I feel it leads into it with enough confidence, and I don't feel that they especially clash too much in this instance. But I feel like certainly a lot of games do feel like they're lying to you when they're putting that as their beginning, and then they change midway through.
Yeah. But I suppose, I think in order to kind of get onto this topic a bit more, I think we'd have to go into spoilers. So I think now is a good time maybe to wrap it, and we go on and talk about the spoilers for the next episode. Is there anything else you want to add just before we finish up?
I will say that personally, I think I have a very generous view of this game, because it was my thing. I would probably give it an 8. I would say it's deserving between the 6 to 8 range of a score. And I would say if you're into story-driven games and, you know, you're into the horror aesthetic, this is a beautiful, really well-developed game. If it looks like your thing, it probably is. If it doesn't, I'd say you could probably pass on it.
Yeah, I think I would have like what you said there, I'd be kind of a similar opinion too. I think the gameplay for me just kind of, like, as much as, you know, I understand that it's not the core aspect of that game, it's something I do expect to see a bit more of. So if I had to put it on a range, you know, considering story, music, gameplay, I'd probably put it at a 6 out of 10. I would say though that even if you're not a huge fan of those sort of like, you know, walking simulators as being described as, which again is a very simplistic way of looking at it, I would say if you're big into stories and games, give it a shot. You know, maybe play, you know, at least get up to sort of the midpoint we were talking about, and kind of go from there. If it's still not your thing, yeah, I'd say probably skip it for then, but at least give it a try if you're big into stories. I think on that note, we'll probably finish it up. If there's anything else you want to add.
Oh, thank you all for listening to our first episode.
Yes. If you want to get in contact with us, you can follow us on, I believe we have a Facebook page now, which had to be set up in order for an Instagram account. So we have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter account. They'll all be linked below. You can also contact us on our business email, which is also linked below if you want to get in touch with the podcast. As well, What else do I need to mention? Oh yes, next week we will be looking at Remedy's Control. We mentioned it a bit in this episode, but we will look into it more in depth next week, as the most Ultimate Edition has just come out. I think we were to mention that, I think you can purchase the Ultimate Edition. It's Standard Edition, which is on Game Pass. Big controversy around that with PlayStation users, but it is what it is. We will look into it more next week. So if you've enjoyed this video or this podcast, whatever you're listening to it on, please give it a like and consider following the podcast. And we will see you all next week.